Chilling tales for dark nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications.
The skeletons were dancing. Their bleached appendages clacked and scraped together in a jumble of ulnas and tibias. They moved gracefully, inasmuch as skeletons could move at all, in perfect synchronicity. Harold Freeman stared at them in open-mouthed astonishment, a vague recollection of his schoolboy days dancing around the corners of his memory. There are 206 bones in the human body, 270 at birth. That is until the extra bones fuse into the final number of 206. Harold, write this down, please. Harold had never been much of an academic, but that random fact from Sister Mary Bernard's third-grade science class lingered in his mind as he watched the animated bones glide across the polished floor. This had to be some dark dream, a wispy figment of his excellent dinner come back to torment him. Harold was an elegant man of large appetites, the author of his destiny who believed that moderation was for imbeciles. The way he saw it, you were either a victim or a predator, and Harold had no desire to be someone else's lunch. He dined on the weak of mind, a first-class con man and thief, dealing mainly with the old and infirm. The force of his larger-than-life personality always drew them into his various schemes and elaborate plans. That last old bird had given him $52,000, the entirety of her life savings for his once-in-a-lifetime land deal, before shuffling off this mortal coil. Although she was helped along to paradise by a healthy regimen of poisoned herbal tea served with tiny little finger sandwiches by none other than Harold himself. No one was ever the wiser. They never were. He had lost count of how many had met a similar fate, preferring not to dwell on the unpleasantness of his chosen occupation. He had a refined palate, voraciously inhaling life's pleasures where and when he found them, and needed a healthy income to keep them coming. Food was always the first item on his list, followed by a taste for fine wines. At 6'5" and tipping the scales at a hearty 377 pounds, Harold barreled through life, eating up every second he possibly could. He wondered darkly if his skeleton would dance on its own, buried as it was in layers upon layers of Harold, itching to shed him like a fleshy cocoon. He was so engrossed with the skeletal couple that he failed to take in the music that served as the backdrop for their ghoulish swaying. He chastised himself for the oversight. Harold was also quite the connoisseur of music, the classical pieces of yore tickling his fancy. He'd played the French horn in his school orchestra and could always pick out its melancholy, haunting sound in any performance. His ears perked up as he closed his eyes, feeling the crust and swell of the music. When he opened them again, he rubbed at his sockets furiously, not wanting to believe what he was seeing was even remotely possible. An entire demented orchestra loomed before him, rotting, decaying corpses with instruments that appeared to be made of bone, muscle, and gore. The conductor was something ripped from the pages of a Gothic novel, his left eye dangling down his desiccated face, wild brittle hair framing the continents that would have been welcome at the very gates of hell. Over 7 feet tall, with his tuxedo moldering off of his half-rotted frame, the conductor held a large razor-sharp femur bone in his right hand while keeping tempo with his left. He was very passionate about the music as pieces of him flew off in every direction, plopping softly onto the floor. Harold knew that he had heard this music before, was trying to identify it as he also gazed in disbelief upon the orchestra. They ranged from skeletal to fresh and every stage in between. The violinists were raw and angrily red, splashes of blood and carnage flying in their wake as they sawed away at the strings of sinew. The flutists were delicate, mummified creatures, which Harold found endlessly amusing, for every flute player he had ever met in his band-playing days was precisely that way in real life. Their brittle fingers worked upon the keys, and he wondered how they could blow so well into their flutes without a lip or nose to be found in the entire section. He noticed that the trumpet players were a thing of macabre beauty. Black as pitch, they appeared burned and disfigured. Hunks of charred flesh oozed off of their faces as they played, smoke billowing from red-hot instruments. Harold experienced a moment of ghoulish fancy, imagining the entire brass section engulfed in flames. There were many occasions when he'd wished fire and brimstone upon trumpeters, for they were a notoriously arrogant lot. The rumbling of percussionists briefly caught his attention. A Lovecraftian vision. Enormous slug-like apparitions with countless eyes were gripping their mallets and slimy tentacles, pounding away in a fury. In between movements, they would reach out in their horrific grasp and snatch away pieces from the half-decayed woodwind players seated directly in front of them. Harold watched in disgust as one of the supernatural slugs gobbled down a mangled ear, slurping and smacking away in gruesome ecstasy without ever missing a beat. The skeletons doubled back again, surprisingly nimble on fossilized feet, as the waltz played on and on behind them. Harold had a moment of clarity, finally placing the name of the piece. Of course, it was the Wiener Blut, the Viennese Blood Waltz by Johann Strauss II. We played this many times in my orchestra. I should have recognized it immediately. In a display of pure fancy, Harold closed his eyes and began to move along with the hypnotic music. For such a portly man, he was incredibly light on his feet, twirling around the floor amongst the ghastly ensemble. The waltz moved along to its stirring conclusion, a timpani drum roll with the entire brass section that Harold was itching to play again. He hadn't touched the French horn in years, but somehow he knew that he could do it, picking right up where he left off. Faster and faster, he spun, 1, 2, 3, waltzing his imaginary partner around the floor as the skeleton struggled to keep pace with him. He was free, filled with glorious abandon as the music carried him along. As the very last notes washed over him, Harold paused and noted an empty chair in the brass section, exactly where he used to sit all those years ago. An enormous, blood-red French horn sat on the chair, glistening in bits of gore and huge wriggling worms. One of the tiny creatures managed to extricate itself and began climbing up the player's leg in the next chair. Harold took in that his fellow horn player appeared to be half skeletonized already, the worms doing their work all too well. Pieces of flesh still lingered upon him or her. Harold had no idea, except for a complete scent of pulsating lungs that inflated and deflated like a balloon. It finished the final movement and gently placed the bell down on its non-existent lap, turning to Harold expectantly. He could hear the last notes of the piece still floating through the air, the hellish orchestra observing him, awaiting his reaction. The skeleton dancer stopped moving and stood completely still in anticipation. Harold began to applaud. Always one to give credit where credit is due, even in the most distressing of situations. At first tentatively, and then with gusto. He cheered their efforts, for it truly was a masterful performance. The conductor turned and took a final bow, his red eyes piercing Harold with malevolence. "Bravo! Bravo!" he said over and over as they basked in his admiration. The conductor stepped down off the dais and came face to face with him, close enough for Harold to detect an earthy, rotten smell with just a faint hint of sulfur. Harold could see, hidden in his unruly thatch of hair, something he hadn't noticed before. Suddenly, everything clicked into place as he finally identified the knotted horns on the conductor's horrific head. Harold had a sudden vision of a restaurant. An entire Chateaubriand all to himself, with an impeccable bottle of full-bodied 1985 Médoc Rouge. He raised a toast high into the air to celebrate the death of his latest mark, followed by sudden eye-watering chest pain. After that, everything was a blur. Or was it? Harold quickly took stock of his life and knew that his prospects at the moment were greatly diminished, to say the very least. He had only the briefest of moments to ponder his many sins before the conductor lashed out with his femur shiv and sliced cleanly through Harold's windpipe before raising the bloody bone high into the air. Hell's orchestra rushed forward and slowly began to tear Harold apart. It took them quite an age, for there was a lot of Harold to digest. They fell upon him in waves, feeding by each instrumental section until the entirety of the ballroom was covered in blood and discarded offal. The flutes and oboes each daintily gnawed upon a limb, paring them down to the bone quite nicely in seconds as the bassoonists and trombones started in on Harold's ponderous stomach. The string section went in to liberate his well-worn liver, while the slimy percussionists looped his large intestines around and around their hideous forms like shiny pink coats. The remainder of the string and brass sections fought over the scraps. And Harold thought it only appropriate, since they were constantly jockeying for position within any ensemble. Their grim task nearly at an end, the worms were unleashed to do their duty as they pruned Harold's considerable form down to the bone, leaving only his lungs untouched and in their proper place. He was grateful that he had never smoked a day in his life, for his lungs appeared pink and full, ready to play for eternity. The orchestra moved back into position as the skeleton dancers considered this updated version of Harold, unencumbered by gobs and gobs of extra flesh. They held out their hands to him as he rose from the floor, reborn into his true self at long last. He carefully made his way over to his new chair on bony feet, swaying wildly as he found his balance. He joined the dancers as they moved across the floor and back to their starting point. Harold picked up his new French horn, the worms falling to the ground as he lifted it to his freshly made skull and got into ready position. The conductor tapped his grisly baton onto his music stand, then raised it high into the air, signaling that they were ready to begin once again. They would play the Blood Waltz. The creature that had once been Harold Freeman knew that it would always be the Blood Waltz. On and on in an eternal loop, as the orchestra played and the skeletons danced around them. As he took his rightful spot in the ensemble and began to play, Harold could feel the first pangs of a gnawing, insatiable hunger as Hell's orchestra anxiously awaited its next inductee. Harold might not dine well this night, but he knew that he would never dine alone again.
Saturday, December 22nd, 2 p.m. Sean Kilpatrick loaded up the trophy buck, securing it to the back of the four-wheeler. Wiping a light sheen of sweat from his forehead, he chuckled at the unpredictable Arkansas weather. 1 minute it was below freezing, and the next warm enough for shorts. Taking off his gloves, he finished tightening the rope. Thrilled his fingers were no longer frozen. A smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. Emmett Jeffries would be so jealous when they rolled up to camp. The 12-point catch was Sean's last tag for the season. Jeffries had yet to shoot one. "What's so funny?" Jared Starkson asked. "Just thinking about how irritated Emmett will be. I won our bet. He hates losing." Jared's laughter reverberated through the quiet woods, only to be drowned out by several planes screaming overhead. Both men looked up, watching the strange spectacle. Sean silently counted 20. Wonder what's going on." Jared shrugged his shoulders. "Looks like they came from the Jacksonville Air Force Base and are heading toward Dallas. Awful close to Christmas for practice maneuvers." "You have no sense of direction. That's south." Sean pointed the direction of the planes. "Dallas is west of here." "That's why some nerd invented GPS." Jared deadpanned. "You know, Jeffries ain't gonna pay up. The man's tighter than a virgin's asshole." "True, but it ain't about the money anyway. At least not for me. I enjoy pissing him off." "Yeah, I get that. You ain't changed none all these years. You're worse than an old woman holding on to a grudge for something that happened ages ago." Sean snorted. "You'd be singing a different tune had Emmett porked your prom date. And in your own car." "Probably. The difference between the two of us is I wouldn't still hang out with the loser after, what, over 20 years? Oh, and I wouldn't be a cop either because I'd have a felony arrest record for assault after beating the fucker to a pulp." "Yeah, you would," Sean chortled. "I, however, enjoy tormenting him every chance I get. Mental scars last much longer than physical ones." Jared shook his head while climbing onto his four-wheeler. The age-old, my dick is bigger than your dick game. Gotcha. Since we're on the subject of tormenting others, will you please explain to me why you haven't kicked Craig out of the hunting club yet? I mean, we're risking a lot by having him here. What if he slipped and brought some shit here? We would lose our jobs. You really suck as a friend sometimes." Sean frowned. "Craig lost his way after the sudden death of his wife. Would you still be as harsh with your criticism if he opted to hit the bottle like you tend to do, rather than snorting coke? Doesn't matter because that ain't what happened. Booze is legal to buy. Coke ain't. We're cops and he's a lawyer. We all know better. End of story. Craig's been clean for 6 months. Stop worrying. He needs the support of his friends, not condemnation." "Will you use that same argument with the chief? If so, I guarantee you it won't work. You gotta let that thin skin of yours toughen up and stop being so nice to others who can fuck up your world in a flash. That's why after we get back to camp, I'm heading home. Already got enough meat for the rest of the year. I don't want to tempt the fates any longer. Craig's a liability." "Your choice, not mine." Sean settled on his own machine after taking a picture of the buck. He clicked over to Facebook to upload it, but nothing happened. The little blue ball in the corner continued to turn. Damn woods, no cell service. You and social media, you're almost as obsessed with it as you are with Marion. Oh, and speaking of her, what's going on with you two? Rumor around town is your unit's been seen at her office several times during the last week. Please tell me that's not true. I can't take any more of your bitching about her shenanigans. Sean grimaced at the mention of his estranged wife. Gee, and I thought to be able to vent is what friends are for. Guess I was wrong. As I mentioned, your friendship skills are sorely lacking. Give me a break. I've endured way above my quota of listening to you dissect your relationship. You married fools are the reason I've stayed single. After she cheated on you and got knocked up by another man, you said the marriage was over. What's changed now? Did she learn how to give a better blowjob or agree to a three-way? Watch it, Starkson. A flame of anger ignited in Sean's gut. That's my wife you're talking about. We're working things out. We have no choice. There are always choices, Sean. Jared raised an inquisitive brow. What? Oh, shit. Please tell me it ain't yours. The anger from seconds ago dimmed as Sean recalled the last discussion he had with Marion and her gynecologist. He hadn't told a soul about the results of the DNA test since he found out 2 days prior. Yeah, it's mine. Oh, shit. Jared's dark brown eyes widened from shock. That does change things. If it were me, I'd have already skedaddled out of town. Believe me, I was so shocked, a kitten could have knocked me over. Sean let out a huff of air. I've convinced myself it wasn't mine. Still sort of numb about the whole thing. Can't believe I'm gonna be a dad. Wow, me either. You're a better man than me. Even if it was my bun in the oven, not sure I'd want to turn on the stove someone else cooked at. Despite the intense subject matter, Sean laughed. His best friend since second grade had a sick sense of humor. That's why you're the whore dog and I'm the loyal retriever. So when does this little bundle of joy arrive? Due date is January 26th. Oh, and in case you're interested, we're having a girl. Jared let out a low whistle. Let's hope she takes after the loyal retriever side of the tree, not the enough Jared. Again, that's my wife and child you're talking about. Gunfire broke the silence of the woods. The sounds of weapons discharging were common during deer season and wasn't the reason they both froze. What transformed the two friends from carefree hunters to concerned cops was the volume of shots fired and the terror-filled screams of grown men. Exchanging glances with Jared, Sean saw the worry he felt on the inside beaming across his friend's face. They fired up the four-wheelers, flying through the woods back toward camp. Sean topped the hill and stopped, turning off his four-wheeler. Jared did the same. Let's go in on foot. They both reached for their rifles and dismounted, creeping through the dense underbrush toward the encampment. Sean and Jared had spent every hunting season in the same woods for over 20 years and knew the area well. The eerie silence made goosebumps stand erect on Sean's neck. No chirping birds or squirrels, not even the usual din of insects. As they picked their way closer, he strained his ears for any sound. The gunshots had ceased, as well as the screaming. The stillness was more terrifying than the noise. Upon reaching the edge of the camp, their original concerns morphed into fear. The camping chairs surrounding the fire pit were overturned, food and utensils left where they had been dropped. Impressions in the dirt indicated a lot of activity. What the hell? Sean muttered. Jared crept over, hand hovering over the ashes. Cold, been out for a while. Stepping over to the front porch, drawn to the disemboweled torso of the 12-point buck Craig Jackson shot earlier, Sean grimaced. The thing had been ripped to pieces and strewn from end to end of the long porch. Nothing was left except skin, antlers, and bone. Glancing up, he searched the area and counted all the vehicles. 16, just like when they left, yet none of their hunting buddies were around. A cell phone lay face up on the ground, the edges coated in blood. Peering closer, he noticed the last number dialed was 911. The front door to the 8-room cabin they all shared was wide open. Several sets of bloody footprints led inside. The bay window had been shot out. Shattered glass glistened in the afternoon sun. All their four-wheelers are still here too, Jared whispered from Sean's right. Something gold and shiny caught his eye. Then another, and another. The empty shell casings left a trail from the front porch into the interior. Snapping his fingers, Sean pointed. Jared's face blanched at the vast amount of spent ammunition and blood splatter. Both men went into cop mode, sweeping the cabin, keeping their steps tight and quiet as they followed the trail of bullets and blood. When they reached the back door in the kitchen, they were greeted by bloody handprints on the floor, walls, and doorknob. The back door was ajar. Strange chomping sounds filtered from the back porch. Sean recognized the noise first and mouthed, "Bear?" Jared looked at the amount of blood pooled on the floor and shrugged his shoulders. Holding up his fist, the signal to remain still, Sean took a long step backward and peered out the small kitchen window to get a better view. Fearing his fellow hunters had been victims of a four-legged predator, he needed to see exactly what they were dealing with, and how many. Black bears were abundant in the area, and maybe a family of them had stumbled upon. Time froze the minute his brain registered the incoming signals from his eyes. A wave of dizziness slammed into him so hard he saw double for several seconds. "Craig, what are you doing?" Unable to contain his thoughts, Sean muttered, "No way." Jared took one step forward toward Sean's position. He whispered, "What is it?" It was the last words Officer Jared Starkson, the 43-year-old best friend of Sean Allen Kilpatrick, would ever say. The second the sentence left Jared's mouth, Craig Jackson leapt into the kitchen, landing on top of Jared. Both men fell to the ground. Jared's gun clattered to the floor. In shock, Sean hesitated for a split second before firing. The bullet ripped through Craig's shoulder, but didn't stop him. Jared's screams gurgled to a stop after Craig opened his bloody mouth, latching onto Jared's windpipe. He tore it out with one bite. Jets of red arterial blood shot from the wound, coating Sean, the walls, and the floor. Taking a deep breath, Sean took aim and fired again, this time hitting Craig's thigh. Blood and flesh burst from the wound, but Craig never gave any indication he felt a thing. Jared was no longer fighting to survive. His body convulsed from the enormous loss of blood. Sean knew only seconds remained before he died, so he chambered another round, blowing Craig's head off. The bullet exited Craig's skull and entered his best friend's, killing both instantly. Oh, Jesus, what in the hell?" Sean muttered while staring at the bloody mess in front of him. He couldn't grasp the fact he just killed two of his friends with one shot. The question was answered by the appearance of Frank Wilson's mangled body. Unable to walk since both sets of thigh muscles were gone, Frank pulled himself into the kitchen by grabbing onto the edge of the door. Sean's stomach juices burned up the back of his throat while gaping at the thick smear of intestines and blood left in Frank's wake. Frozen in horror and shock, he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Frank's eyes were solid black. Strange wiggly blue lines reminded him of a road map covered the face and exposed arms. His wits returned after Frank opened his mouth, letting out a spine-chilling growl. On autopilot, Sean raised his rifle and fired. The bullet pierced Frank's skull just above the bridge of his nose. With one last gurgle, Frank's head slammed into the wood floor with a loud thump. Noise outside caught Sean's attention. Stepping over the corpses on the kitchen floor, rifle steady, he looked out the open door. His mouth went limp. A sea of blood and flesh littered the backyard. 14 bodies in various states of dismemberment were strewn across the dead, dried leaves. The ground gleamed crimson underneath the mid-afternoon sun's rays. The only way he could tell they were his friends and hunting buddies was from their torn clothing. Upon realizing two half-eaten bodies still moved, he was hit with another bout of dizziness. Stepping back into the main part of the cabin, forcing his fingers to quit shaking, he extracted his cell. He prayed the sporadic cellular service worked. It didn't. He was greeted by a robotic droning voice. "We're sorry. All circuits are busy. Please try your call again later." "That's for landlines, not cell towers," Sean roared into the mouthpiece. With no choice left but to leave and get help, or at least get closer to a functioning cell tower, he pulled the keys from his pocket. Adrenaline pumped throughout his muscles. He burst out the front door, across the yard, and to his truck. Nerves on edge and mind spinning, he fumbled to get the door open. Once inside the cab, he set his rifle in the seat next to him and tried to stick the keys into the ignition. They slipped from his fingers, clattering on the floorboard. Damn it! Bending down to retrieve them, the weird grunting sound he heard Craig mumble earlier hit him. It came from the right. Snatching the keys from the floor, he shoved them into place, and the engine roared to life. The growing sense of dread didn't stop him from glancing out the passenger window. Holy fuck! The once familiar face of Martin Lawson stared back at him through the glass, his eyes the same as the others. The ebony nothingness was like staring into the pit of hell. Martin's white cheekbones and the upper part of his teeth, where the soft flesh had been ripped off, sparkled in the sun. The sickening sight was like a magnet, pulling all of Sean's attention to the gore. The pull broke when Martin's bloodied hands slammed against the window with enough force the glass cracked. Enough of this shit. I'm out of here. Slamming the truck into reverse, he tromped the gas. In seconds, he was on the narrow dirt road leading him away from the carnage at Deer Camp. He never let up on the gas and made the 3-mile bumpy journey to Highway 270 in record time. The gravity of the unbelievable situation left tears sliding down his cheeks. Inside the quiet cab, he offered up silent prayers for the dead. About 4 miles, he tried the phone again and got the same results. Willie's pit stop was less than a half-mile away. He could use their phone. Pushing the Ford F-150 hard, zooming down the empty 2-lane highway at over 90, he tried to remain calm, which was impossible. Jerking the wheel, he pulled into the parking lot and slammed on the brakes. He left his truck running, jumped out, and ran inside. Malvern Police official business. Need to use your phone. Sean yelled, looking around the quiet store for an employee. Silence greeted him while making his way to the counter. Hello? Gut instincts, honed from years of being on the force, kicked him right square in the gut. Slowing the pace, he inched toward the counter, eyes scanning the dimly lit interior. Less than 3 feet away from the cash register, he smelled it. The thick odor of copper and the stink of bowels made him hold his breath. Death. The floorboards creaked underneath his weight. Stepping carefully, he peeked behind the counter. His ragged breath caught in his throat. There wasn't much left of Willie. The old man's snow-white hair looked as though it had been dipped in a can of red paint. The cavity holding his internal organs was nothing more than strips of flesh and rib bones. Clutched in his right hand was a Ruger, a spent shell casing resting near his head, a gaping hole on the other side. God, I hope you blew your brains out before... Backing up, Sean moved over to the cash register where an ancient black rotary phone sat. It had been in the same place since he was a boy. Willie Hopkins was too cheap to purchase a new one. Sean hadn't seen anyone use the old thing in years and hoped it still worked. Picking up the dirty receiver, he winced. No dial tone. A grumble rose from the back room Willie used as the office. After what Sean experienced in the cabin down in Poyen, he didn't feel the need to see what made the noise. He had bet everything he owned he already knew. Racing back to the idling truck, he floored the accelerator and headed toward Malvern. Dead, leafless trees zoomed by in a blur as the speedometer neared 100. When he passed the road sign noting Malvern was only 5 miles, he tried his cell again. Dead air. What in the hell is going on? 1,000 thoughts raced through Sean's mind at almost the same pace as the speeding truck. In minutes, he crossed the city limits, hitting the brakes when he came upon a blockade of military vehicles obstructing the entrance to downtown. What in the world? Sean slowed for a better look. A large group of people covered in blood and gore ambled toward the county jail, some in uniform, some not. His touch with reality snapped. Stomping on the gas pedal, he zigzagged around the vehicles, yelling gibberish the entire time, forgetting all about Jared, Craig, Frank, Willie, and the others while dodging the dead. All he could think of was getting to Marion and their unborn daughter. By the time he made it to town, he realized things were much worse than he imagined back at camp. Hundreds of dead bodies and abandoned vehicles littered the streets. While dodging them, he realized the rifle in the seat next to him wasn't near enough protection from whatever was going on. Spotting an empty Humvee up ahead, he pulled up next to the driver's window. Making sure no one, or thing, was close enough to hurt him, he rolled the window down and peered inside. The front seat was covered in dried blood and brain matter. A female in fatigues lay motionless in the passenger seat, half her head in the driver's side, frozen fingers still wrapped around the grip of her weapon. Scanning the rest of the vehicle, he felt a spark of hope. 3 fully loaded M4 carbines rested on the middle console, and the keys were in the ignition. Glancing around once more, he made sure he was still alone. Satisfied he had enough time to check, he crawled partially through the opening and turned the key. The Humvee rumbled to life and had a half tank of gas. Slinking back into the cab of his truck, he snatched the hunting rifle and backed up about 4 feet. After rolling up the window, he shut the engine down, locked the door, and ran to the passenger's side of his new ride. "Sorry about this," Sean mumbled to the dead soldier. Wincing at the smell and sight, he gritted his teeth and pulled. Unwilling to just leave her in the middle of the street, he dragged the stiff body to the edge of the curb. A grumble to his right made the hairs over his body stand on end. He knew what it was and felt no desire to look. Running back to the Humvee, he climbed behind the wheel, executed a U-turn, and headed toward Marion's. He made it less than 200 feet before the quiet afternoon filled with the faint sound of the EMS siren. He slowed down and felt around for the assault rifles, overcome with the need to have them close and ready. His hand touched an unfamiliar shape. Sean slowed to a crawl, craning his neck to see what it was. A rocket launcher? Why in the world did they... Oh shit, they planned on... Sean broke out into a sweat when the sound of automatic weapons drowned out the noise of the siren. More planes streaked across the sky. In the clear afternoon sun, he saw the last thing his eyes would ever take in. Bombs falling from the sky. Some weird instinct made him throw his hands over his head as the first bombs hit nearby, making the entire Humvee shudder. Oh shit. I'm sorry, Marion. I tried. I really did.
Why does it feel I've lived this night before? Mike thought as he guided the bus down the road. Sometimes it feels that a night can go on forever. Even as the new day dawns, you find your mind slip back into the twilight. Who's to say we don't all exist in an eternal loop? Some soul hanging a carrot and stick over your shoulder, leading you in circles as they leach the energy from your soul. Twisted minds prefer to dwell in the unlit corners of the spiritual plane, those sinister spirits that prey on the unwary. This story, dear reader, is a story about one of those spirits. So wherever you are, shut the blinds, lock your door, and check under your bed. For the Quaker might be watching. A multitude of dark towers rose above the horizon. The bus driver's tired eyes gazed out of the foggy windows at a sky with no moon. Thick clouds swirled and formed above. The yellow-tinged rain splattered the bus's windows, discolored from the cheap lighting of the street lamps that passed by the bus, turning everything into a wayward Van Gogh. A name tag reflected passing headlights. NYC Transport, Mike Flanagan, appearing and disappearing as quickly as a rabbit in a hat. The bus engine hummed, struggling through another large body of water, its wipers beating together in a rhythm more familiar to the driver than his own heartbeat. The clock on the dash showed 11:34 p.m. Flanagan's bloodshot eyes stared at him through the rearview mirror, surrounded by dark sockets and pale skin. I look like a fucking zombie. Looking past his haggard face, Flanagan saw that the 3 passengers hadn't moved. The bus drove down the street towards the empty bus stop. Pulling in, he waited. Only a few more stops until he'd be heading home to see Jane, and extended leave to attempt another patch-up on his already sinking marriage. The overtime and night shifts had killed all affection from their love life. All that held them together now was the little bump beginning to show on her stomach. Checking around once more, he didn't see anyone, so he pulled off. At the end of the street, he turned right. An empty train passed by overhead, the rumbling tracks barely audible under the thunder and rainfall. The Weather Channel said the storm was going to be here for another day. Damn storms, he mumbled to himself. Always getting in the way of everything. Just one more night, Jane, please.
Hello?
The young man at the back of the bus answered loudly.
I can't hear you, Mom. What? Mom, why are you crying? Stop crying, please.
He went silent, and then hung up the flip phone and stuck it in his pocket. The color had drained from his face. The young man stared out the window, looking up at the lightning spiking through the gloomy atmosphere. Flanagan eyed him for another minute through the mirror, at the others who were docile and gazing at nothing. The old woman on the left hadn't spoken since getting on, and the little girl was still blowing bubbles with her chewing gum. It was funny now that he thought about it, because he couldn't remember where any of them had gotten on. Pulling into a bus stop, he waited, and was about to pull back off when a heavy thumping sounded on the bus's door. A black figure silhouetted from the headlamp's face was barely discernible under the large-brimmed hat he wore. "What you waiting for, an invitation?" said Flanagan. The figure remained motionless. Flanagan leaned over and pulled out the torch he kept under the dash for emergencies. He switched it on and pointed it down towards the door. The man was dressed in all black clothing. Flanagan thought he looked a bit like one of those religious farmers. Quakers, they were called. "Are you getting on or what? I haven't got all night," said Flanagan. "Do you believe in destiny, Michael?" The Quaker spoke softly. He should have been washed out beneath the wrath of the storm, deafened by the thunder, but every word was crisp and cold as ice. "What'd you say?" Flanagan called back. He stared at the man, noticing his hat and coat were dry. Not a speck of rain was visible on the fabric. "Our kind has to stick together, Michael. You just watch that tunnel now. A man can get trapped in there." The man's head turned a fraction too fast, like some glitch.
Who are you talking to?
A quiet voice asked from behind him. "Jesus Christ," Flanagan said, jumping up from his seat to see the little girl standing behind him. There was an odd expression on her face. "Who do you think I'm talking to? Him." He pointed the torch back down to the doorway. Rain fell in through the open door. The floor was covered with water. The man was gone. Flanagan jumped down the steps and pointed the torch around outside, looking for any sign of the strange man.
There was nobody there.
The little girl looked down at his name tag.
Mike? I looked up as soon as you started talking. The doorway was empty.
Flanagan scoffed at her. "He was dressed in black. You just couldn't see him."
I could see the bus stop. Unless he was transparent. I don't think so.
Flanagan rubbed his forehead as he sat back down and shut the doors. All right. Don't mind me, little miss. I've not got much sleep the last while is all."
Well, should you be driving then, Mike? A man can hurt himself driving tired. My Uncle Dave was cut in half by a dozing truck driver.
Flanagan looked at the girl in the rearview mirror and jumped with fright as he stared into the darkened face of the Quaker. It's you. Flanagan turned around. The little girl was shaking her head.
I think I'm going to get off here, Mike. This is my stop. I don't want to go any further.
No, don't be silly. Look, if you say nothing about this, the fare's on me, huh? What kind of transporter would I be if I let you off in the storm? Good, Michael. Very good, a voice whispered. The girl nodded after a moment and walked back to her seat, watching him. She put a school bag on her lap and reached inside. Probably got pepper spray in there. Great, thought Mike. He put the bus in gear and pulled off. At the end of the street, he turned left, headed towards the Madison Tunnel. The tunnel. Flanagan reprimanded himself. He felt like laughing. He had never had a good imagination. His wife could attest to that. To think he could have imagined someone was ludicrous. When the bus was halfway down the street lamps flickered. On, off, on, off. Yellow, dark, yellow, dark. Then they stayed dark. A man could get trapped in there. He could see the Quaker's face in the window's reflection, crouching down and whispering into his ear. Our kind has to stick together, Michael. Come now. Isn't it time you listen to me? You're not real. Leave me alone. I just want to go home and see my wife. Flanagan tried to swat him off. But you know that's not true, Michael. We must realize the truth in order to change. You must listen to me. You must find peace, sweet Michael. Go away! The Quaker's eyes began to glow as he talked, two tiny red orbs hovering beneath the hat's brim. Flanagan's knuckles were white from gripping the steering wheel. Taking his right hand off the wheel, he flexed it, inhaling deeply. I'm not seeing you. I'm not seeing you. I'm not seeing you, Mike repeated to himself. Denial makes it truth. You deny me now thrice, Judas. Look into my eyes, and I shall show you truth, sweet Michael. Flanagan looked around, faced the Quaker. The bus rattled and shook as it moved over bumps and puddles. He looked into those red glowing embers and saw. It was an eternal storm hanging over a city of souls. The people were sat by windows or in chairs, staring at nothing. The Quaker was with them, a balance between light and dark, hanging on a precipice as thin as a razor. Such is the battle that rages behind curtains and within shadows, sweet Michael. Flanagan saw his bus from the outside sweeping past. He saw the wind beating at the high towers, the orange moon hidden behind those yellow-gray clouds, the hopeless eyes gazing up at it. Then he saw a shape in the sky. Something was familiar about it. Something familiar about the way it floated through the sky. Yes, Michael, see. Before your time is up, you must see. But the clouds swirled in the wind. The tempest blew and clawed at the shape until it twisted and shattered and was blown into a million pieces and was gone. Flanagan sat back in the driver's seat. The passengers hadn't moved. He rested his shaking hand on his lap. Looking back at the road, he could make out the lights of the tunnel. As the bus got closer, there seemed to be something in front of it. The bus sped on, the wipers screeched. The roof sounded as if it would cave in from the pressure of the rain at any moment. They hit a puddle, jerking the bus. Flanagan wiped his forehead. His hand returned covered with sweat. The dark object was getting closer. Is it a car broken down? No, there was no hazard light flashing. Flanagan glanced in the rear view, then back onto the road. The lights outside flickered back on as the object disappeared. He took his foot off the gas, hovered over the brake. The lights flickered off. The dark object reappeared, 3 or 4 car lengths away. It swerved onto his side of the road, and he hit the brakes and the bus skidded, kicked out as it went. He could make out 2 horses now, galloping through the rain. They wore harnesses, black plumes of feathers on their heads that blew against the wind. They were pulling a dark carriage, a figure whipping at them from atop it. They galloped straight towards the bus. Flanagan could see the muscles flexing on the horses' bodies, sinews tensing beneath hair. The whites of their eyes glowed. Sparks shot out from their metal shoes as they collided with the road. He jumped back against his seat, bracing for impact, waiting for the violent clash, screaming. As the horses came into contact, they passed through the glass. The driver of the carriage came closer, the red embers now having cooled to 2 lumps of onyx that coldly watched him. Time slowed. The Quaker passed within touching distance. His blank, coal-hued eyes seemed to look right into Flanagan's soul. The tunnel. Michael. The tunnel. Quick, get out. Get out. It drilled into his mind, echoed, distorted. He shut his eyes, wishing for it to end. The bus slowed, coming to a stop as it hit the curb. Flanagan took a deep breath. Opening one eye, peering around, he saw that the road was clear. The street lamps were back on. Sweat trickled down his forehead into his eye. He wiped it away with his trembling hands. Looking down the road, the tunnel stood only 100 yards away.
What are you doing?
A voice spoke from behind him. Mike spun around, expecting an altogether different source of the voice. But finding the 3 passengers all standing parallel to each other, they watched him with blank eyes and pale faces.
We must go through the tunnel,
The girl said.
That's where my family is, and I have to get back to them.
The man nodded.
My mother's ill. She's worried sick. Listen.
The man brandished his phone to Flanagan. There was a woman stood beside a grave holding a picture of the man, crying. He saw a figure stood behind her, a dark figure.
See?
The man said.
You must get me home.
Mike shook his head. I don't want to go through the tunnel. Not yet. Not ever. The old woman took a step forward and her face filled with compassion.
I know what I am. I will go through the tunnel. Don't be afraid, dear.
Mike opened the door and she stepped out into the storm. She turned and offered a hand to them. The little girl skipped past him and down the steps after the old woman. Mike looked over at the young man who was still holding out the phone. The scene had changed. The grass was now long. The headstone, old and faded.
You sure you're not going through? I'd much rather be on the bus.
The young man had fear in his eyes. I can't. My wife, we're having a baby. It's going to work. I know it is. Mike saw the young man nod, then fold his phone and slip it into his pocket.
Well then, thanks for bringing me this far, I guess.
He walked past Mike and got off the bus, running across the intersection after the old woman and the little girl. The rain had eased off and a thick curtain of fog rolled across the ground, swirling after them in their wake. Mike sat down and shut the door and watched them all disappear into the tunnel. Walking down the plane aisle, Flanagan found seat B13 and put his backpack into the overhead compartment, then took his seat. Last night felt like a dream. He put it down to fatigue, and that was all. There were no phantoms in the taxi to the airport, and no near collisions with oncoming carriages either. A woman put a bag into the overhead compartment and sat down in the seat next to him. They smiled at each other, and she buckled her belt. She reached into her bag and pulled out a magazine and began flipping through it. He turned to the window and thought about last night. Maybe it was time he moved out of the city. It seemed like it was getting to him. The night shifts and the lack of sleep. It was too much. The flight attendants were showing the exits now. The plane's engines began to pick up as they started rolling. He'd tell his wife that he was thinking about moving back for good and begin looking for jobs. It would all work out. It would.
Terrible accident last night, wasn't it?
The woman next to him said. Uh-huh?
The tunnel collapsing, you didn't hear?
She looked at him now, eyebrows furrowed. He felt his pulse peak. Where was that?
Madison Tunnel. A few vehicles and civilians were passing through it when it happened. It was a terrible accident, but if it had been during the day...
She shook her head. He nodded and she went back to her magazine. Taking his phone out from his pocket, he typed Madison Tunnel into Google to see for himself. Was the man his guardian angel, perhaps? His wife had always told him there were such things, but he never believed her. The runway rolled by outside of the window. It was a sign to get out of New York and back home. A figure passed by the window's reflection. He caught a glimpse of it. His stomach lurched. He sprang around, sitting up as much as the belt would give. The man stood facing him in the aisle. He could only make out the slight smirk beneath the rim of the wide hat. The Quaker tilted his head back. Those coal-hued eyes pierced into Flanagan's soul, his lips breaking into a smile, revealing crooked, sharp teeth. You've got to be kidding me. The woman beside him turned to the aisle to see what he was looking at.
Who are you talking to?
She looked back at him. You can't see him? He asked, looking at her. Then looking back at the aisle, it stood empty. No, this can't be happening. He unbuckled his belt. The plane began climbing away from the ground, making him wobble as he stumbled past her into the aisle. No, stop! Turn around! He screamed, running down the aisle towards the cockpit. The flight attendant went to grab him. He pushed her away, running for the cockpit. A large man in front of him stood up. Hands grabbed him from behind. He felt the pressure in his head as someone held him in a chokehold. His vision began to swim. Flanagan could barely make out the black shape further back down the plane. Flanagan could only faintly hear the joyful laughter as he slipped into unconsciousness. His last thoughts were of that laugh, how it seemed to taunt him, how it seemed to float from somewhere a million miles away. Jane Flanagan had just gotten out of the shower. She walked into the kitchen with a towel wrapped around her waist and another in her hair. Walking over to the kitchen sink, she poured herself a glass of water and switched on the TV, taking a sip of the cool water. She flicked through the channels and then put it back onto the news.
We've just received some breaking news. Flight 3284 crashed after takeoff.
The news reporter on the screen stated.
Michael?
Jane whispered as the glass slipped from her grip, and it hit the floor, smashing. Why does it feel I've lived through this night before? Mike thought, as he guided the bus down through the darkened street. He looked back in the rearview mirror at the 3 quiet passengers on the bus. The bus traveled down the street and into the dark surroundings, disappearing into the mist. Sometimes it seems that a night can go on forever. Even as the new day dawns, you find your mind slip back into the twilight. Who's to say we don't all exist in an eternal loop? Some soul hanging a carrot and stick over your shoulder, leading you in circles as they leech the energy from your soul. Twisted minds prefer to dwell in the unlit corners of the spiritual plane. Sinister spirits prey on the unwary. And this story, dear reader, is a story about one of those spirits. So wherever you are, close the blinds, lock the door, and check under your bed. For the Quaker might be watching. There's a certain impersonal charm to grocery stores. People pass each other, usually avoiding eye contact, and cloaked in a security blanket of inconspicuousness. And the homeless that you often find outside these places, well, they might as well be a light pole or a park bench, hiding in plain sight. Duncan Wickman was a busy man, much too busy to give back to those in need. But today was different. Today, whether you call it humanity or good in the world, his graciousness overrode his apathy, and he took time out of his day to show compassion to the less fortunate. A simple act that would change the course of his life forever. Duncan looked down at his Rolex as he stood in line, holding a pack of spring greens mix and a bottle of sweet tea. He knew he was probably late for something, but just what it was escaped him. As he scurried out the grocery store, a homeless man sitting next to the Coke machine called out to him, "Hey, buddy, you got any change?" Duncan, who would normally keep walking, stopped and turned around. A charitable feeling seemed to come over him.
You thirsty?
He asked the man.
Sure, I'd take a soda.
Duncan smiled as he set his bag on the ground and pulled out his wallet. He put $2 in the machine and handed the man a soda. The homeless man smiled widely as he cracked it open and took a swig. He set the drink down and shuffled through his backpack, then pulled out a dirty glass beer mug.
Here, it's a token of my gratitude.
He held the mug in the air towards Duncan, who reluctantly grabbed it.
Thanks,
Duncan said. He dumped out the cigarette butts that were scattered in the bottom as he walked towards his car in the parking lot. He opened his door and threw it into the back seat. That evening, after he got home, he grabbed his briefcase out of the car along with the mug that laid next to it on the seat.
Well, what's that?
His wife Lillian asked curiously as she chopped some vegetables in the kitchen. Their son Aiden burst out from around the corner and hugged Duncan.
It was a gift. A token of gratitude,
he said with a smirk.
I bought a soda for a bum outside of the Albertsons, and he gave this to me.
Lillian got a surprised look on her face.
Since when did you start associating with those people?
I don't know. Something just kind of came over me.
Well, just be careful. So many of them are either crazies or high on drugs.
Duncan chuckled as he washed out the mug under the kitchen faucet.
I was homeless once.
Shut up,
she replied.
No, really. I shot my dad in the eye with a rubber band gun, and he got so mad, I ran out of the house and spent the next night at a campground near where we lived. Survived off of beef jerky and Pez candy.
She laughed.
I don't think that counts.
Duncan wiped off the beer mug and held it up to the light as he looked it over. He could tell by how heavy it was that it was probably commercial made. It cleaned up nicely, he thought to himself. April 20th.
Hi, Duncan.
The secretary of his law firm said in her nasally voice.
This is kind of strange, but we just had 2 of our main clients terminate their contracts with us.
Duncan sat up in his office chair and a look of concern came over his face.
What? Don't tell me one was the Saunders trial.
There was a brief pause.
Yes, that was one, and also Dominique Fratelli.
Shit! Well, did they say why?
Saunders is citing that you're not returning his phone calls, and Fratelli says that you haven't been listening to his wishes.
I wasn't able to return Saunders' phone call yesterday because my phone locked me out for some reason, and Fratelli needs to take a plea bargain. Otherwise, they're gonna fry his ass. Duncan spent Saturday at the driving range with some colleagues. Would you believe that son of a bitch Dean Saunders just dropped me as his attorney? The trial of the decade, and midway through, he decides to terminate me. Duncan swung his club fiercely, launching his golf ball downrange. The group of men looked around at each other.
Actually, Duncan, Saunders is now my client. He called me a few days ago,
Tony Spicola said.
You know how it goes sometimes. I couldn't say no.
Duncan, despite the surprised look on his face, tried to play it off. Hey, business is business, right?
You're not upset, are you?
Duncan grinned sourly.
Upset? No. Don't worry about it.
Tony smirked.
Good, because afterwards I put a down payment on a condo for me and Brittany.
Duncan spoke with Lillian after he got home. I just can't believe the balls Tony has to take a client of mine like that.
Listen, it's one client. And if you were in Tony's shoes with an opportunity like that, what would you do?
Well, I would hope that I wouldn't fuck a friend over like that.
Maybe you should start advertising again.
He sighed and looked away dismissively. I haven't had to advertise in years. Lillian rubbed his back with a look of despair on her face.
Just think about it, okay?
May 3rd.
This was a case of mistaken identity. The state has failed to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that my client, Mr. Javier Garcia, assaulted Mr. Williams on December 18, 2021. Numerous witnesses have corroborated his accounts that he was instead visiting with friends, miles from where the alleged assault took place. Even Mr. Williams himself has contradicted his own testimony. Your Honor, today we seek an acquittal of all charges. This concludes the defense evidence, Duncan said, then smiled confidently. The judge exited to his quarters for a recess. Duncan turned to his client. The only thing you gotta worry about now is where you're gonna celebrate at after we win this. The judge returned to his bench after a short time.
Mr. Javier Garcia has been charged with assault causing bodily injury. In particular, it is alleged that on the evening of December 18, 2021, Mr. Garcia brutally attacked Mr. Darius Williams after an altercation that the two men had. The judge looked towards Duncan. Sometimes relying on questionable friends and acquaintances as witnesses doesn't always present the most solid foundation for a defense case. That, coupled with the circumstantial evidence that the state has presented, I conclude that the state has established its case against Mr. Garcia beyond a reasonable doubt. Mr. Garcia, I would ask that you stand now. I therefore find you guilty of first-degree assault and sentence you to 10 months in the Pueblo County Detention Center. Duncan had a look of shock on his face. Questionable witnesses, he mumbled. His client looked over at him, grimacing. Don't worry, we're going to appeal this, Duncan whispered to him. The judge didn't like the fact that one of the witnesses was a prostitute that Garcia hired for the night. He held it against him, the whole trial, Duncan said to Lillian as he undid his tie. She listened from the bathroom.
Well, you can appeal it, right?
Oh, I'm gonna appeal it, that's for sure. He walked over to the dresser and grabbed his glass of scotch and took a drink. The drinks were becoming stiffer and more frequent. Lillian walked in the room.
Another one?
Duncan flung his arms in the air. Yes, Lillian, I'm having a drink. It's been a long day and I'm trying to relax, okay? Duncan had been sober for 7 years. It didn't mean he didn't enjoy it and have a drink every now and then, but he hadn't had an incident for quite some time. It was always in the back of his wife's mind, and with anyone who's an addict, relapse is always a hellish reality. She looked at him with a sinking look on her face.
I just don't want you to get in that place you were in when you were drinking heavy.
Christ, what is it with you? You just have to keep bringing up my shortcomings, don't you? It's not enough that I have my own law firm. It's not enough that I buy you this beautiful house that we can't even fucking afford to live in.
He turned away and took a deep breath. Then he turned around and walked towards Lillian, who had tears in her eyes. He put his arms around her.
I'm sorry. I've just been under a lot of stress lately and was self-medicating again, which I know isn't the answer. I love you, and I don't want you to have to worry.
June 10th. With business declining, Duncan had finally caved in. He stood in his office surrounded by a film crew as he began shooting for a commercial. The director was a young, overzealous film school graduate who treated the shoot more like a trailer for the next Expendables movie. He carefully positioned Duncan, who was holding a sledgehammer, next to his certificates on the wall.
Listen, you're Duncan the Hammer. So when I yell action, I want you to swing your hammer over your head.
This was totally ridiculous, Duncan thought to himself, but he went along with it anyway.
Okay, action!
He swung the sledgehammer over his head.
I'm Duncan Whitman, but my clients call me the Sledgehammer. Over the years, I've helped thousands of people win their cases. That takes experience and aggressiveness. Cut!
The director yelled. He spoke to a producer off to the side between takes.
I never thought I'd be advertising again.
The producer cracked a smile.
TV advertising's a no-brainer. After a few weeks, your phone will be ringing off the hook.
June 29th. It had been just over 2 weeks since Duncan's commercial first aired on TV. He laid a stack of papers on his secretary's desk.
So, any new clients so far this week?
He asked.
One today, divorce case. But actually, business seems to have slowed down more.
Duncan put his head down.
Fuck,
he whispered under his breath. He looked up with a distant look in his eyes.
What's going on? I went from averaging 10 to 12 cases at once to 2 all of a sudden. I've never had this little of a caseload ever, even when I was starting out.
His secretary looked up at him.
Maybe I could stand in front of the office twirling a sign,
she said in her dry, sarcastic tone. Duncan frowned.
So much for that damn commercial. Have you even seen it playing?
She nodded.
Yes, I've already seen it twice today.
He sighed.
Well, at least I can pay you to do something.
August 3rd. Duncan laid wide awake next to Lillian in bed when he suddenly turned to her.
I was thinking about asking a couple of the guys that I play golf with if they could use another attorney in their office.
What are you talking about?
She said groggily.
I can't afford to keep the firm open. I don't have the business anymore.
She removed her sleep mask.
You've just had a bad couple of months.
Well, I can't afford to have another bad month. This isn't something that I want to do. This lifestyle that we've become accustomed to. I don't know how much longer we can maintain it.
After playing a few holes at Saturday's golf game, Duncan finally managed to open his throat up wide enough to swallow his pride.
So, on a professional note, would any of you guys be interested in a merger of sorts?
Duncan said as the men walked toward the clubhouse. Dennis Bates turned around.
Merger?
Duncan put his head down.
I think I'm going to end up closing the firm.
What? Dennis said, shocked. Since when did Duncan Wickman ever have to worry about keeping his doors open?
Well, Dennis, up until about 3 months ago, I guess,
he replied.
Anyway, if any of you could use my services, I'd look at it as a personal favor.
The men all looked around at one another, and there was an empty silence. Dennis finally spoke up. I'll keep you in mind, Duncan. Then Harry Campbell chimed in.
I just hired 2 interns. I only hire females.
Tony laughed inappropriately.
No, I'm kidding. I'll keep you in mind, pal.
Duncan nodded glumly. September 17th. Duncan stared longingly at his law degree certificate and thought about the feeling that he got when he won his first case. He pulled a shooter of bourbon from his shirt pocket and took a drink. Then he threw the empty bottle onto the floor.
You can clean it up, you sons of bitches, he mumbled to himself pitifully. The doors had closed on his practice a few weeks earlier, and he packed up the last of his belongings. Later that afternoon, he lugged the packing boxes downstairs at their house when he heard Lillian's car pull into the garage.
Hello?
She called out. Down here. Lillian went downstairs to see Duncan putting away boxes. When he turned and faced her, the smile quickly left her face.
What's wrong?
Duncan asked.
You're drunk again, aren't you?
Duncan tried to hide it, but he couldn't conceal the smell of whiskey on his breath.
No, why would she think that?
He said, slurring his words.
Liar,
Lillian said as she darted upstairs. Duncan threw the box down he was holding and clenched his fist, knowing that he blew it again. The glass beer mug that was packed inside fell out onto the floor, making a loud thud, and rolled next to his foot. He reached down curiously and picked it up. He looked at it, surprised that it didn't shatter, then threw it back into the box.
I want you to start going to AA meetings again,
Lillian said after she was sure that Duncan had sobered up. He turned to her.
Fine. I'll start back up tomorrow, right after I get out of the unemployment line.
He scowled.
When I asked the guys if they had any openings at their firms, they couldn't even offer me a position as a janitor,
he said bitterly. September 23rd. The following week was turbulent between Duncan and his wife. They barely made eye contact, let alone spoke. Then one day, Duncan came home, holding a bouquet of roses.
I came with a peace treaty,
he said, as he smiled and handed them to Lillian. She took them and looked down at the ground tepidly. He gently grabbed her arms and gazed at her.
Look, we can start over. You, me, and Aiden. I got offered a job. It's a legal assistant, not exactly what I was wanting, but it's a foot in the door.
Lillian looked up and smiled softly.
And we can sell this place. It's too much house for the three of us anyway.
Her smile wavered.
But I love this house.
I do too, but there's no way we can stay here on my income now.
She nodded heavy-heartedly. October 5th. Duncan and his wife sat in the office of a realtor they had hired to sell their house. Okay, Mr. and Mrs. Wickman, so I ran the numbers and I have a little bit of troubling news. You folks had your home built a few years back when the housing market was hot. You've heard the term a seller's market, right? Well, now we're in a buyer's market. The feds raised the interest rates and now we have more homes for sale than we have buyers. It's not as bad yet as the crash in '08, but I think you're going to be underwater. Duncan looked over at Lillian nervously. So you owe a little over $800,000 on your mortgage. After comparing recently sold properties and similar homes on the market, I think a fair asking price would be more like $715,000.
$715?
Duncan blurted out.
That's almost $100,000 less than what we owe.
I understand that, and you can always ask for more. The problem lies in the bank. Banks don't typically want to give borrowers more money than what a property appraises for. There's a chance that you'll have a buyer that brings cash to the table, and in that situation, you may get your asking price. The two looked at each other.
Could you just give us a few minutes to talk things over?
Duncan asked the realtor. Absolutely. I'll just step into the office next door, and when you're ready, just come get me. Duncan turned to Lillian.
So here's what I'm thinking. We list a house for what we owe on it, plus his commission. I can just pull from my IRA if we come up short on our payments in the meantime.
But that's our retirement money,
Lillian said worriedly under her breath.
I know, but I don't think we have any other option at the moment.
Duncan got their realtor's attention and he stepped back into the room.
So me and my wife had decided to list our home for the balance on our mortgage, plus your commission, so $840,000.
The realtor got a surprised look on his face. Wow, ambitious. Okay, well, like I said, there's a chance we might luck out and get a cash buyer. But otherwise, he nodded, but not in an affirming way. We just don't want to scare off any potential buyers, if you know what I mean. Duncan smiled ambivalently.
I understand, and we're prepared for that.
On Monday, Duncan started his new position at the Rozzo Law Group. He'd be working under one of the lawyers there and spent the morning getting briefed on his responsibilities. So, Duncan, I understand that you're a practicing attorney, so a lot of these tasks may seem a little mundane, but just know I'm happy to have someone of your caliber working for me. The young man paused, then smiled. Maybe this could even lead to a promotion for you. Who knows? Duncan felt small and insignificant at that moment. I was winning cases before this kid even had hair on his balls, he thought to himself. He forced a grin.
Thanks. I'm just happy to be a part of the team.
December 20th. The weeks turned into months, and besides a few lackluster showings, their home still remained on the market. Duncan walked through the master bathroom with their realtor.
Are you sure you're showing the buyers all the features of this place?
He pointed at the jacuzzi.
Look at this custom tile work. I mean, you just don't see stuff like this. This place is stunning.
It's very grand. I just think that this is one of those places that takes the right person to see it. And unfortunately in Pueblo, we just don't have the clientele. Now, if it were Denver, on the other hand, there's a good chance that it would have already sold. The realtor paused. Duncan, I'm going to shoot straight with you. It might be time that you and your wife call your bank and look into lowering the price. Neither one of us want to waste our time here. That night, Duncan filed a hardship letter. He decided that their best option would be to lower the price of their home through a short sale.
Once this place sells, the bank should forget the difference,
he said to Lillian as he typed at his laptop.
Our credit score might take a hit, but it's better than a foreclosure.
January 8th. Duncan nervously opened a letter addressed from their bank and read the contents. He threw it on the table with a sigh of disgust.
What's wrong?
Lillian asked. There was a long pause.
It's a deficiency action.
She had a puzzled look on her face.
Basically, they want whatever we still owe on the house after it sells.
Her face twisted with concern.
But what about the hardship letter that you filed?
Duncan scowled.
They're bloodsuckers!
He shook his head.
If you wouldn't have wanted this damn house, we wouldn't be in this mess.
Lillian teared up.
That's not fair.
Duncan stared at her eerily.
Oh, I'll tell you what's not fair. Watching the business that you built crumble to the ground, or having your retirement fund drained in a matter of months.
Lillian sobbed.
I just want our future together.
Future? What future? I'm working as an entry-level legal assistant, making grocery store wages. We just lost our house, for Christ's sake, Lillian!
Duncan looked up and saw Aiden watching tearfully from the top of the stairs.
I can't do this anymore,
Lillian said as tears streamed down her face.
I want out.
Duncan arrived at work 40 minutes late the following day, stumbling into the office. Tyler, the lawyer he was working for, glanced at his watch, then walked up to him.
Duncan, is everything all right?
The traffic was bad.
He was so intoxicated that he could barely complete a sentence.
Duncan, you can't be here like this. Joe, could you give me a hand here?
Tyler called out.
I'm going to get you home. Amber, take a message for me until I get back.
He told the secretary. The two helped Duncan to the parking lot, and Tyler drove him home. Duncan came in to work the next morning, but was stopped by the secretary before he could make it to his workstation.
Duncan, I'm sorry, but I believe Tyler needs to have a word with you. If you could just have a seat.
She motioned with her head.
In the lobby.
Tyler showed up a few minutes later.
Come on back, Duncan,
he said as he ushered him to his office. He paused for a moment, then sighed.
I can't have you back here working for me after what happened yesterday.
Duncan tried to smooth things over.
Listen, about yesterday, I had a really unfortunate set of circumstances arise the day before. But trust me, it won't happen again.
I wish I could, but it shouldn't have happened in the first place. There's a chance that if you seek some kind of substance abuse counseling, maybe we could look at rehiring you again in the future. Tyler gestured with his hands.
Look, whatever's going on, I'm sorry. There's help out there, though.
Duncan's dignity melted into a puddle of goo on the office floor. He stood up and adjusted his tie, trying to maintain whatever composure he had left.
Well, thanks for the opportunity and for giving a shit. Or at least pretending to.
When he got home, Lillian's car was gone. He stepped inside their house and found a note on the kitchen counter. It read,
Going to stay with my parents. Took Aiden with me. This isn't the type of environment to raise a child in.
Bitch!
He exclaimed, slamming his fist down. In a fit of rage, he drug his hand across the table, sending everything flying onto the floor. A picture frame containing a photo of him and Lillian laid face up and cracked on the ground. January 26th. After finally selling their home earlier in the month, Duncan spent the better part of the morning loading his belongings into a moving van. Lillian showed up in the afternoon with her brother to pick up what things she still had left.
You can have the furniture. I don't want any reminders of this place,
she said to him. A little later, Duncan sat in the garage, separating his tools and smoking a joint. He flicked the ashes into the glass beer mug that was now sitting on a workbench. Lillian walked up to him with a surprised look. She gasped.
You're smoking pot now? Really, Duncan?
He glanced up at her but didn't respond. He just kept sorting as he casually shifted his eyes back to what he was doing.
That's a great example you're setting for your son,
she said as she shook her head and walked off. The rundown apartment that Duncan was renting looked like a funhouse that was decorated by the Kardashians with his chic Italian furniture in it. He stood back and looked around after he finished unpacking.
Looks like law school finally paid off.
He grabbed his bottle of whiskey off the kitchen counter and took a swig.
4!
Dennis Bates yelled as he swung his golf club. He adjusted his glasses as he looked down the range. He turned to Harry Campbell.
Who the hell is that?
Harry squinted.
It looks like Duncan.
Duncan showed up drunk, carrying his golf clubs and stumbling towards where the men stood.
I know I'm a little bit late, but I was busy consulting with a client. Homicide. Guy offed his wife.
His eyes got big.
Hey, we can all relate, right?
He said darkly.
Dennis scowled. You're drunk, Duncan, and you look like hell.
That's no way to talk to a fellow colleague, Dennis.
Duncan, you need to leave, Tony Spicola said as he grabbed his arm.
You get the fuck off me,
Duncan exclaimed as he ripped his arm away from Tony's grip. He pointed at the men.
Where were any of you when I needed you?
He teared up.
I gave you a start at my firm, Tony. Then you go and take clients from behind my back.
A security guard pulled up in his golf cart.
What seems to be the issue here, gentlemen? I'll tell you what the issue is. This maniac is disrupting our game,
Dennis said. Duncan spit in his direction. The security guard got out of his cart.
Sir, you need to leave this course right now, or I'll be contacting the police.
Duncan grinned.
Okay, I'll go,
he said, staggering backwards. He then frowned menacingly.
I'll go. But I won't forget how you all turned your backs on me.
February 15th. Lillian heard a knock at her parents' front door. Her mother came up to her room a few moments later.
Duncan's outside. He's asking to see Aiden.
Aiden came running into the room.
Daddy!
Lillian crouched down and looked him in the eyes.
Go into the other room and play with your Lego set, okay?
After he ran out of the room, she turned to her mother.
It's not good for Aiden to see him like this.
Duncan, I'm sorry, but I guess Aiden's not here right now.
I don't believe that.
He forced his way past her mother.
Lillian! Lillian! I want to see my son!
Lillian barged out of her room frantically.
You need to leave, Duncan, or I'm going to call the police.
I haven't seen Aiden in weeks. You can't keep him from me.
All of a sudden, her father came up from the basement aiming a shotgun at Duncan.
You're in no condition to see your son. Now I advise you to turn around and walk right back out that door,
he said stone-faced, motioning with his shotgun. Duncan put his hands in the air.
I don't feel welcome right now, Richard. You could have at least offered me a refreshment first.
Lillian's brother, who was outside shoveling the animal pens, overheard the commotion and ran inside. He grabbed Duncan from behind and threw him out of the house. He landed on the ground, then got up and dusted himself off.
Lillian! You can take my house and my pension. Those are all just things, but you can't take my son! You hear me?
He yelled, flailing his arms in the air. Lillian wept as she watched from her window.
So on February 15th, Mr. Wickman came to your parents' residence, forced his way in, and was yelling aggressively? That's correct,
Lillian replied. The court clerk sighed.
You wouldn't believe how many women I see like yourself that are dealing with vindictive exes, stalkers, perverts, peeping toms. The list goes on and on,
she said, shaking her head.
You made the right decision by getting a restraining order, though. It's a way for us to manage those sickos. Now, if he does show up or starts harassing me, what happens then? You call the police and he gets arrested. Violating a restraining order is a Class 2 misdemeanor. That's punishable by up to 4 months in jail.
Lillian smiled, feeling somewhat relieved. April 11th. Duncan walked into the Loaf and Jug to speak to the store manager. A young kid in sneakers with the tongues flared out, looking a little on the sloppy side, walked out of the back room. Duncan extended his hand.
Hello, I'm Duncan Wickman. I'm here for my interview.
The kid shook his hand and pulled up his pants that were falling off his waist.
Hi. If you just want to follow me to the back, we can get started,
he said, opening up the half door that led behind the registers. Duncan followed him to a dimly lit office. The kid turned down his speakers that were blasting music.
I got a few questions that corporate makes me ask. So, why are you interested in a career with the Loaf and Jug?
To be honest, you were hiring and you're about 5 minutes from my apartment.
Fair enough,
the kid responded as he typed at his laptop. He looked closely at his screen.
It says you used to be an attorney? I gotta ask, why are you applying at a gas station?
Duncan chuckled and looked down at the floor.
Well, I guess I wasn't the best attorney, so I wanted to try my luck in the retail trade sector.
The kid stared blankly at him.
Okay. Well, you're definitely qualified. Actually, probably overqualified. The last thing we need is a UA.
You guys UA here?
Duncan said, surprised.
Unfortunately, yes. That won't be a problem, will it?
Duncan left the store feeling disappointed when he noticed a man panhandling on the street corner. People seemed to be eagerly handing him money. Duncan pulled up at the stoplight, rolled his window down, and flagged him over. He approached his car with a smile on his face, surely expecting some money, or maybe even a pack of smokes.
Hey, how much money do you make out here doing this?
Excuse me, brother?
Do the cops ever harass you?
What the fuck you mean? You got some change, or you just gonna waste my time?
Duncan looked down and searched his compartments for change, but all he could find was a stick of gum.
Here you go.
What the fuck is this?
The light changed, and Duncan began to drive off. The man threw the stick of gum at his car and huffed. April 20th. Duncan looked out his window when he saw a tow truck hooking up to the front of his Mercedes.
No! No!
He yelled as he ran downstairs and into the parking lot.
What are you doing?
He shouted. The tow truck driver was a large, burly man in suspenders. He looked up as he finished attaching his winch.
You Douglas Wickman?
Duncan nodded.
I'm from the repo company. You didn't make your payments.
He opened his passenger side door and pulled out some paperwork.
I got your order right here. Mercedes-Benz C300. It says you're 3 months behind.
I put that check in the mail last week!
Duncan exclaimed in desperation. The tow truck driver just hopped in his cab, and as he drove away, Duncan watched his reflection get smaller and smaller in the truck's side mirror. He kicked the ground, then leaned on the light pole.
Fuck!
May 11th. Duncan sat on his couch holding the glass beer mug. His expensive Italian leather cushions had now lost some of their shape and were covered in stains and the occasional cigarette burn. He grabbed a terry cloth off the coffee table and began carefully buffing the mug to a shiny finish. The nightly news was on in the background. Tonight on News 5, Dean Saunders, a successful dentist and well-known socialite, was found not guilty of sexually assaulting several women at his practice. The news broadcast then cut to a clip of Saunders making a statement.
I just want to first of all thank everyone who believed in my innocence, and secondly say thank you to my attorney, Tony Spicola, who successfully defended me against these reprehensible accusations.
Duncan frowned and changed the channel.
Suck-ass,
he muttered to himself. Taking the bus to the business district, Duncan was exposed to the gritty underbelly of the city. He sat next to an elderly Hispanic woman.
Do you need to switch seats?
He asked her. She looked over at him but didn't respond.
Are you getting off soon? Do you need to be in the seat next to the aisle?
No entiendo,
she said with a confused look on her face. He stared out the window, watching the scenery fly by, when he could see someone glaring at him from the corner of his eye. He looked over his shoulder and saw a rough-looking man in tattered clothing scowling at him. He nervously hid his wallet in his sock and looked away, wishing the bus ride was already over. He got off at the bus stop and walked into the Walgreens. He went to the first aid section and took off his backpack, looking around for security cameras. He pretended to be reading labels as he unzipped his bag. At the moment he was about to steal a bottle of hydrogen peroxide, the store manager rounded the corner. Duncan clumsily fumbled the bottle, causing it, along with several others, to fall off the shelf.
I know what you're doing, and you need to get the hell out of here before I call the cops,
the manager said excitedly.
I don't need any more of your kind stealing from here.
Sorry, he whispered shamefully. He stepped over the pile of bottles and walked out the store. When he got home, he chugged the bottle of whiskey and rolled up his pant leg, exposing an open wound. He poured the whiskey over his laceration and painfully gritted his teeth from the sting of the alcohol. He then ripped an old t-shirt into a strip that he used as a bandage. The next morning, Duncan loaded up his backpack with all the personal belongings that would fit inside it. An eviction notice sat on his kitchen countertop. He ventured out into the city carrying a cardboard sign scribbled in marker that read, "Hungry and desperate. Anything helps. God bless." Seems pretty straightforward, he thought to himself as he sat on the curb, resting his back against the stoplight pole. He sat there for several hours as the traffic came and went. When someone would motion to him, he'd hold out his mug and they'd drop in some change or hand him some food or water. At the end of the day, he counted out his money. $9.52. $9 for 5 hours of panhandling. It was somewhat discouraging, but he was able to buy a sandwich and a shooter of brandy. It helped to warm the bones as the temperature dropped in the evening. He took shelter in an alleyway. A stairwell on the side of the building that he slept next to served as an awning. The next morning he returned to the same spot, but seeing that another man was already begging at the intersection. He continued walking across the street, then sat down next to a building, propping up his sign and placing his mug in front of him.
Hey, you didn't see me over there?
Duncan looked up from resting his head between his knees and saw the man that was standing at the intersection hovering over him.
I already cleaned this spot.
Sorry, I don't know how all this panhandling shit works, Duncan replied wearily. The man squinted.
Hey, I recognize you. You were the sketchy dude that was asking me all the questions a while back.
He snickered.
You stick out like a sore thumb. What the fuck you doing out here?
Duncan sighed.
Probably the same thing you're doing out here.
Can I be real with you? You look like a cocky white boy. Either that or the popo. Either one can get you killed out here.
He looked down at Duncan's mug.
Nice beer mug. I'll be taking that as payment for renting you out this space.
Excuse me?
Duncan replied.
What, you don't understand English now, white boy? Well, I'll repeat it in my language. Give me the mug before I knock your fucking teeth out.
You ain't taking my fucking mug.
The man lunged for it, and the two men began to scuffle, eventually falling down in an alley. The man pinned Duncan down and began punching him in the face. Duncan was dazed, but managed to swing his arm, catching the man in the side of the head with the beer mug. He rolled off him and grabbed his head. When he took his hand away, it was covered in blood. Duncan felt a rage erupt inside him. He jumped on top of him and began to bludgeon him, using the mug like a meat mallet. After several more blows, the man finally stopped struggling and his body went limp. The side of his head was caved in, and Duncan was covered in blood. He looked around to see if anyone had seen, then quickly checked the man's pockets for any money or valuables. He grabbed his feet and drug him next to a dumpster. Then, with every ounce of energy he had left, heaved his body inside. He sat down next to the dumpster out of breath. He wiggled his front tooth, which was loose from the punches he took to the face. May 23rd. After several weeks of living on the streets, Duncan learned quickly how to defend himself, who to trust, and just how long he could stay in a certain spot before attracting the attention of law enforcement. The fashion district seemed to pay out the best. The rich folks were either some of the stingiest or most generous people you could encounter. He'd go for 30 or 40 minutes without getting so much as a window rolled down. Then a $5 or a $10 bill would find its way into his beer mug. One day, while sitting in traffic, Lillian noticed a homeless-looking man with a cardboard sign walking down the rows of cars that sat gridlocked in front of her. She didn't think anything of it at first, checking her lipstick in the mirror and tending to Aiden, who was playing on his phone. But as the man trudged closer to her vehicle, she noticed him staring inside. When she got a better look, she gasped in shock. It was Duncan. He was thinner and his hair was long and messy looking. He had a bushy, sandy brown beard that was beginning to gray. He approached her Range Rover with a deranged look on his face and pounded on her window. Aiden put down his phone and screamed.
"Just calm down, baby. Everything's going to be all right,"
Lillian said to him. She tried to ignore Duncan staring straight in front of her, but this only seemed to further agitate him. He pounded on her hood with both hands as he slowly walked around the vehicle. Aiden began crying. Lillian hugged him tightly.
"Leave us alone!"
she screamed, but Duncan just kept circling her SUV and hitting it. He finally stopped next to her window. He opened his mouth and grabbed his loose tooth, yanking on it with such force that blood splattered onto her windshield.
"What the fuck do you want?"
she pleaded. He grinned as blood ran down the side of his beard, seeming to take pleasure in tormenting her. She honked her horn and looked around frantically. Other cars began to honk their horns too. Finally, she screamed and punched the gas. There was nowhere else to go but up on the median, so she drove over the curb, then turned into oncoming traffic. She continued trying to comfort Aiden, who was still crying, then called the police on her phone.
"Yes, hello, this is Lillian Wickman. I have a restraining order on my husband, Duncan Wickman."
"Okay, ma'am. Did Mr. Wickman come to your work or residence?" the operator asked.
"Well, no. I was stopped in traffic and he began banging on my vehicle."
"Okay, he was following you."
"No, he was walking on the side of the road. I believe he's homeless."
"Did he harm you?"
"Not physically, but he scared me and my son very badly."
The operator paused. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Wickman, but unless your husband was stalking you or came to your home, we can't really do much." Lillian got a confused look on her face.
"Wait, my husband just attacked my car, traumatizing me and my son, and you can't do anything about it?"
"I'm sorry, but unfortunately in that situation our hands are tied." Duncan sat outside of the 7-Eleven rocking back and forth while reading the Bible. He looked over at the glass beer mug that sat on the ground next to him, when it suddenly dawned on him. Ever since he was given the mug, his life began a downward spiral. If he was to get rid of it, maybe things would turn around for him. He got up to throw it in the dumpster when he heard a familiar voice call to him.
"Duncan? Hey, is that you?"
He turned around, shielding his eyes from the afternoon sun, when he saw Tony Spicola standing in front of him.
"Here."
Tony tossed a wadded-up dollar at him. He looked at his girlfriend and laughed, then turned to walk off.
"Wait!"
Duncan exclaimed. Tony turned back around.
"Here, I'd like to give you something too."
He held the beer mug out towards Tony.
"Call it a token of my gratitude."
Tony walked up to Duncan with a puzzled look on his face.
Thanks, I guess,
he said as he took the mug. A few minutes later, Duncan slipped his backpack over his shoulder as he got ready to leave. He turned his head suddenly to look towards the sound of screeching tires and crunching metal coming from the street. He walked up to the scene of a head-on collision between two cars, one of which looked just like the Audi that Tony drove. Smoke barreled out from under the hood and the horn was stuck on. Duncan got up close, waving away the smoke as he tried to get a better look. It was Tony's car. He laid slumped over in the driver's seat. His face was covered in blood. The horn finally cut off, and besides a few screams from nearby pedestrians, there was a harrowing silence. Tony regained consciousness and began coughing up blood. He looked around disoriented, then saw Duncan standing next to his car.
Help! Please!
His breaths were shallow and weak, and he struggled to get the words out.
Well, Tony, sometimes life throws a curveball at you. Or I guess in my case, a duffel bag full of curveballs. I lost everything. My family, my house, my dignity. But I was finally able to share that misery with someone else. See? That's what life's about, Tony. Giving back. Sharing. You'll learn that too one day.
Duncan tapped on his roof as to bid him farewell, then kept walking up the street.
When I was 11 and my brother Rourke was 16, Dad moved us to the jungle to deliver the Lord's good word to the people who lived there. He must have thought it would change us, make us into men, lift us above the everyday sins of the other boys littering the stoops of Boston. That's what he called them, everyday sins. Dad said that everyday sins were small things. Small things like not telling the Irish girl who lives in the building across the way that maybe the cat's been sitting in her window, because the way her curtains fall lately, they bunch up around the pull string. And if a person were bending down in just the right way, for example, on his knees, whispering prayers before bed, he might see right through the gap to whomever might be standing there, blow-drying her hair, in clean white panties. Everyday sins can sneak up on you, son. Like bees. One or two aren't so bad, but when you get a swarm of them together, you're in big trouble. Dad had black hair and a mouth that could smile all the way to the corners of his eyes. He was not a religious fanatic or a child abuser, if that's what you're thinking. Dad never beat us with Bibles or locked us in closets or forced us to grasp crucifixes heated over burners. He was just an electrician turned preacher who, in addition to being fond of analogies, believed that God would want men and boys to wear heeled shoes and pressed shirts while they were delivering the good news. He'd been flipping a batch of Dad's famous hotcakes while he delivered the analogy about the bees. Dad cooked us hot meals all the time, and everything he made was famous. They'll sting you swollen, son, if you give them a chance. You have to be on the lookout. He put the plate of hotcakes on the table and we ate them together in the warm kitchen with syrup and butter and cold milk. There were no bees in the jungle. The native women were not like the Irish girl or the lady with the tiny waist on the detergent box. Their breasts fell to their navels like cupfuls of cold molasses sinking slowly down their chests. They were the first breasts I'd ever seen up close. Instead of using a toilet, the villagers squatted over holes, and their nails were thick and yellow. They were all missing a toenail or a fingernail, and sometimes more than one. The girls poked pieces of wood and bone through holes in their noses and ears. and sometimes lumps of scar tissue bloomed up around the holes like chunks of white lime built up around our drain at home. They squatted next to coal beds while they cooked. Some nights the firelight showed me their down there hair and dark parts beneath that hung like flaps. Some had brown and black tattoos on their faces. Some of their heads were as bald as eggs. The men were strong and glossy and hard. They hunted monkeys and butchered them with their hands. Then they cooked up the meat, and the guts too. They even broke open the bones and dug inside with their thumbs and then ate the stuff that came out. Sometimes they pulled out the guts before the monkey even stopped breathing. The children turned over logs and found white grubs the size of pecans that they roasted on sticks before chewing them up. They watched the moon, and some nights they smeared things on themselves and danced in front of bonfires. One night, I saw a baby born. Inside our chapel was very, very hot. The walls and roof were made of heavy pine planks. The planks were the first things we brought in once the road was cleared, said Father Clausen, showing us how to fan out mosquito nets over our beds and weight them at the bottom. He pointed to the 4 glass windows, looking very proud. From a pair of very charitable Christians in Long Island. Real glass. They let the light of Christ shine right in. He beamed. I doubt there's another set of glass windows for 300 miles in any direction. The windows didn't open. The air in the chapel was as hot and heavy as the steam that used to hiss from Dad's iron. Beads of sap oozed from the pine lumber, scenting the smother like Christmas time. Everything was sticky. The few villagers curious enough to attend services brought banana leaves to sit on, so they wouldn't get sap on their bottoms from sitting in the pews. They fanned themselves with fronds, and then stopped coming altogether. Dad said sometimes the good word was like the sound of the ocean. Waves just keep crashing on in the background, and finally a day comes when people see that the waters are cool and clear. People wade in and try to swim. Some of those people will take to the water like fish, and others might not get the hang of it right away. Some people might only dip in a toe. He'd always drop his voice for the next part. And some people need us more than anyone else, because by the time they get to the water, they've already been on fire for a long, long time. Dad was from Chicago first, then Minneapolis, and then Boston. He'd signed a year contract for us, and when the review board asked if he'd had any experience living in the tropical wild, he said, I've studied up. To us, he said, if the Swiss Family Robinson can do it, so can we. The Lord will watch over us. But not many days had passed before it became clear that neither thing was true. We were dangerously ignorant about the jungle. We packed useless things, a swimsuit, a gold pocket watch, a red plastic radio that never picked up a station and ran out of batteries after the first week. Dad bought 3 jars of pomade because he was afraid he'd run out. Nonetheless, he assured us everything would be okay. We were on the Lord's mission, and He was looking out for us. Those first months were a dark time. Our water filter was a heavy contraption that took both hands and all my weight to pump it. In the heat of the day, I'd avoid pumping water until I was so thirsty my head throbbed, and then make it worse by exerting myself in the heat. For food, we had a kind of dried porridge with vitamins ground up in it, and you added water to make a sweet, gritty sludge. The best way to get it down was to drink it fast, like cod liver oil. Suffering in button-up shirts and heeled shoes with socks, we doled out litanies to the strange natives who looked at us skeptically, clucking their tongues and shaking their heads. The village children ran naked in the open air, and we waded into the brown running stream to splash their dark bodies with water. I tried not to feel bitter thoughts toward them. On Sundays, Dad offered sacrament, pressing wafers of host into rough brown hands and making the sign of the cross in the air. On the night in which he was betrayed, Christ broke bread and said, "Take and eat. This is my body, given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." The villagers inspected the paperish discs, taking wary nibbles as if tasting an unfamiliar fruit for the first time without knowing if the flesh would send them into fits or cause chaos in their bowels. Nobody understood a word either side was saying. At night, Rourke and I lay beneath the mosquito nets and felt things crawling on us, scratching furrows in our legs with our grimy fingernails. We'd been itchy and paranoid since the night Rourke had found a millipede as long as his forearm coiled inside his pillowcase. Sometimes we lay in bed and remembered things together, like the icebox back in Boston and the cool fountain in the square. Rory reminded me of Dad's famous potato and fried egg hash with ketchup, and I reminded him of Dad's famous chocolate egg cream, always with an extra sprinkle of Ovaltine on top. One very dark night I dreamed of the Irish girl. She was blow-drying her hair. She turned around and I saw that her breasts were deformed and made of scar tissue, lumps stacked upon lumps like bunches of half-dried grapes. Beneath her white panties something bulged and squirmed. The hard, horny head of a giant millipede emerged from one leg of her panties and wound down the inside of her thigh, circling once before disappearing behind her knee. She held up her thumb, and there was black stuff on it. She sucked it off and smiled, looking right at me, still holding the blow-dryer. I'd wet the bed that night for the first time in years, but Rory didn't notice. The sheets were always damp anyway, and we trained our noses not to smell things. 4 months passed and Dad was sick. He would stand in the palmettos behind the chapel and make himself vomit before morning service, so he wouldn't have to stop the sermon when he felt it coming. Long, flat worms like ribbons came up in the vomit. Yellow stains bloomed in the armpits of his white shirts, and he had to go to the bathroom a lot. He grew thin and grim. Still, he didn't want to leave. He said that nothing was more transient than flesh, and he felt proud that God believed he was strong enough to be tested. Rory and I wondered about this. We also wondered whether or not God considered all meat to be flesh. Were the worms made of flesh? Were the grubs, the millipede, the monkey guts? Were the villagers? What was the difference between flesh and just regular old meat? We couldn't decide. The infection began with a black dot the size of a pea on the top of Dad's foot. It looked like the time I'd stepped on a sharpened pencil, and a smooth pellet of lead had lodged itself in the web of my big toe. At first it only itched. Dad thought it might be a mosquito bite turned blood blister. Maybe he could just coax out a few drops of blood and the thing would turn back into regular skin. He squeezed it between his thumbnails, but nothing came out. When it was bigger the next day, he tried to prick it with the corner of his folding razor. The blade barely brushed the dot when Dad sucked air over his teeth and squeezed his eyes shut, gripping the sides of his foot with both hands as if curling up that way would make the pain stop. The next day the dot was twice as big, and it was no longer a dot. It was a little brown crater with a black pit, and the ring of skin around the crater was puffy and angry-looking. The day after that, the foot was so swollen it bulged out of Dad's shoe like rising bread. And the day after that, the shoe didn't fit at all. For the first time in months, Dad stayed in his bed beneath the mosquito net instead of rising from morning prayer. We tried to cool him by fanning him with fronds the way the villagers did. We pumped the water filter for him and offered him mangoes and porridge. He drank some water and ate a little of the mango, but the porridge came right back up. When he could no longer bear the heat in the chapel, he crawled outside to lie on the ground in the shade of the giant palmettos. His hair hung in greasy strings and his forehead was shiny with oil and sweat. The whites of his eyes had begun to look yellowish. He was embarrassed that he'd had to crawl. 2 days later, Dad didn't even think about crawling. All day long he lay moaning under the palmettos with the mosquito net draped over him, not caring about the ants that marched across his belly, or the centipede making paths through his hair. He kept one hand pressed into his face, either palm down covering his eyes, or palm out with the back of it pressing into his mouth. I think he did that so no more pain sounds would come out. Dad hadn't taken off his sock. He couldn't. The rapid swelling had cinched the seam of elastic tightly around his calf. Flesh bulged above and below the seam, making Dad's lower leg look like a tied sausage. We could have cut the sock off. Despite our ill preparedness in other areas, we managed to bring a pocket knife apiece. Rourke's even had a tiny pair of scissors that folded out, so you could pinch them open and closed with your thumb and forefinger. But Dad wouldn't let us touch his sock. I think he was afraid to see what was happening under there. He didn't want Rory and me to see either, but we knew it was worse than we could imagine because by then, the smell was so bad. Dad's infected leg gave off a smell like fetid cheese and rotten hamburger meat. You could smell it 10 feet away. We'd all done a fine job of training our noses to ignore our own smelly underarms and the bouquet of the latrine hole, but no sane person could ever shut out the smell of Dad's infected leg. My brother and I stole sips of air through our mouths and pretended we didn't notice as we sat with Dad, distracting him with staged arguments about which of his sermons we remembered best. He distracted us with forced chuckles that doubled him over with pain. Dad's moans became high and shrill at the end. Consumed, none of us ate or slept. Rory and I didn't know what was expected of us, and Dad was too sick to say. God was nowhere to be found. After Dad slipped into delirium, he could no longer refuse Rourke's pleas to let him run and fetch Father Clausen. Rory left the chapel early in the morning, disappearing into the spots of brush that had grown over the path since we'd walked it last. He didn't come back until nearly dawn. Father Clausen will be here when the sun comes up. He'll bring some men with a cart and a mule to bring Dad out. I lifted the mosquito net so Rory could climb into bed next to me. What about the doctor? I whispered. There isn't one. Rory groaned softly as he settled into the bed. He sounded very tired. Not a real one. Dad'll have to be flown out the way we came in. Father Clausen already radioed San Tomas for a pilot. Rory was silent for a while. I told Father Clausen about the smell. He asked me how long, and I told him almost a week. After another pause, Rory added quietly, He asked me if we have kin in Boston, you know, just in case Dad. Rory broke off in a heave. I could tell he wanted to cry. At last he said, in case the Lord takes Dad before we make it out of here. He said that in an even, weighted voice I'd never heard from Rourke before. Dad was right about one thing. The jungle had made a man out of my brother. A Presbyterian doctor in San Tomas cut off Dad's pants with scissors that were bent flat halfway down, so they could slide right between Dad's pants and his legs. Then, the doctor used his bent scissors to cut Dad's socks into squares. When he began to peel away the squares, Dad tore at his sheets and screamed to God for the strength to stand it until the nurse rushed in with more morphine. Father Clausen stood by his bed, and Rory and I held Dad's hands as each square was peeled away. His leg didn't look like a leg anymore. The knee was a black bulge with hard, raised bruises, and the gaps between bruises were mounds of flesh so swollen that the skin over them was stretched white and split into hard, bloodless cracks. Below the knee, the bruises became a forest of brown craters, each with a black pit like the first one we'd seen on the top of Dad's foot, the one he thought might be a mosquito bite. Square by square, the infection only grew more grotesque. Ripe pustules on the calf broke audibly to drip green fluid that filled the room with its cheesy, sickening smell. Around the ankles, thick, white, and yellow stuff pooled between chunks of diseased tissue. The foot was nothing more than a spongy, grayish mass, like a wet biscuit, dissolving in mop water. A lot of the squares wouldn't peel off. They were melded to the leg with crumbles of yellow crust, and trying to peel them just caused more flesh to tear away, exposing Dad's long, white leg bone. The doctor called the squares of stuck sock grafted, and said that it probably happened at the very beginning, before Dad's body stopped trying to scab over and heal itself. The doctor gave up trying to remove the remaining squares of sock. Even he looked aghast. "I've never seen anything like it," he kept saying. His accent sounded like the man with the hot dog cart back home. "I've never seen anything like it." Father Clausen took us into a waiting room and swallowed an aspirin and told us that the grafted squares of sock didn't matter anyway. "I'm not a doctor," he said, "but if I've ever seen a clear-cut case for amputation, it was lying in front of me 10 minutes ago." Father Clausen sank into a chair and looked at my brother and I, thin and filthy, blotchy with heat rash and covered with the scabs of bug bites scratched bloody in the night. I could tell by the way he softened that he pitied us. "San Tomas has some of the best doctors in this part of the world," he said. "If your father's life is meant to be saved, these men will save it." The priest closed his eyes, and I knew he was seeing it again. Dad's rotting leg. I saw it too. It was burned into the dark behind our eyelids. He tightened his hold on the crucifix around his neck. Then he opened his eyes and looked at us sincerely. His voice was as soft as a whisper. "Your father should not be alive. God is truly walking with this man." God may have been walking with Dad that day, but Dad himself would never walk again. The doctors found rot running all the way up to his hip, so that's where they amputated. The place where Dad's leg once met his pelvis was now just a concave socket, the size of a baby's head, with prickly stitches like long, black caterpillars, holding the skin in place. There was a tube in Dad's arm for morphine and fluids, one in his chest to pump antibiotics in, and another beneath the covers to pump other things out. A long time passed before Dad was conscious enough to speak. Father Clausen made arrangements for us to stay at the convent in San Tomas, where the nuns treated us like children. They did not know the things we had seen. When Dad started to come around, the doctor called Father Clausen and he drove us from the convent to the hospital in his big green Buick. I stood beside Dad's bed so excited I began to cry. Dad opened his eyes, then closed them for so long I was afraid he drifted off again. But at last he broke the seal of scum, cementing his lips together, and the first thing he said was, "Where is it?" Father Clausen looked at us and we both shrugged our shoulders. "Dad?" Rory said gently with tears on his cheeks. "We're here. Simon and I and Father Clausen. You're going to be all right." Rory's throat caught and he glanced at the lopsided mound of blankets covering Dad's lower body. I mean, you're going to make it. You're not going to die." Dad didn't say anything for a minute. I squeezed his hand. His head turned on his pillow and he looked at me incredulously. "Didn't you hear me ask you a question, son? I said, where the fuck is my goddamn leg?" Back in the waiting room, the doctor with the accent of the bent scissors spoke to Father Clausen in a rapid, rolling language. Father Clausen looked at the floor with his hands clasped behind his back, nodding. When the doctor was finished, the father turned to us and said, "The doctors think that your father's fever has damaged part of his brain." I stammered, stunned and confused, but Rourke was angry. His fists were tight balls at his sides. "The problem with our dad was his leg, Father, or didn't you see it? Because I did, and my little brother sure did. A fever can't change a person that way. When I had the mumps, I was as hot as a skillet for 3 days, couldn't bear a stitch of clothing or a spoonful of broth, and I didn't wake up a swearing blasphemer." Father Clausen nodded, still looking at the floor, this time with his hands clasped in front of him. He started to say something, then stopped, as if he changed his mind about what to say. He started again, carefully. "Son, every part of a man is controlled by a specific part of his brain. When one part of the brain is damaged, he might forget how to walk. Another part and he forgets how to swallow, or how to speak, or how to read, or write, or do arithmetic. These doctors say that sometimes, not very often, but sometimes, a very special part of the brain gets hurt and the person forgets what kind of person he is. They think that in your dad's case, the fever just burned that part of him away." Father Clausen put his hand on Rory's shoulder. "May God be with you, boys. The church will do everything it can to help you and your father through this trial. You must have faith." Rourke clenched his fists more tightly and shrugged out from under Father Clausen's hand. "God had his chance, Father, and the church brought us to this Gomorrah to begin with. I don't think we'd like any help from either of you. In fact, I think my brother and I ought to be alone right now." He took me by the arm and began to turn away. Father Clausen's voice called out, "This is a time for joining together in prayer, not for casting blame." Rourke did not turn back. "There's one more thing," called the priest. Something in his voice made Rory stop. "Your father says he won't leave here without his leg." The man in the hospital bed had Dad's face, but nothing else about him was the same. When the nurses came to change his bandages, he waited until they were leaning over him before he tweaked their nipples through their smocks, and asked if all the women from their country were sluts on wheels with titties of steel. He held his fork with the wrong hand and laughed at things that weren't funny. They wanted to know where the fuck were his goddamn cigarettes. Wide filter Pall Malls, as if he'd smoked them every day of his life. Even his breath smelled different. I know, because right before we landed in Massachusetts, he grabbed my collar and pulled me close. "Those olive-eaten sawbones said they'd never seen the bug I got," he told me, his voice low. He was so close I could feel hot breath in my nostrils. Said maybe it was the first time anyone got it.
anywhere in the whole world. And I said, isn't that something? Hey, why don't pack the whole thing up and ship it back to the good old US of A? Maybe have the fellas from the Mayo take a look at it. For research, just so I can make sure I do my part. He smiled a smile that made his face dark. Then I looked at the sawbones with my eyes real big. Big, wide, crocodile eyes. And I say, I want to do my part to see this tragedy don't befall another living soul. Not if I can do anything about it. He laughed Swedish breath into my face and I recoiled. He yanked me fiercely back to him. It belongs to me, after all. It's my goddamn leg. You can't just toss someone's leg in the garbage like a used rubber. So they said, yeah, maybe I had a point. Those brains at the Mayo are thinking up new medicines all the time. Pills to stop your headache, cure the clap. Even pills to make your dick hard. Those guys may have something doing. So the sawbones trussed it up in a big glass tube full of some of the formaldehyde stuff, locked it in with these big steel caps. I saw them loading it into the cargo hold. Looks like the biggest pickled pig's foot you ever saw. He laughed again. There was a rattle and a lurch as the landing gear deployed. We were back in Boston, but it didn't feel like home. Nothing was the same. I'll be fucked if those needle dicks at the Mayo Clinic ever get their hands on it. It's mine. Dad pulled me so close his nose touched the skin on my forehead and his voice fell to a whisper that made my skin break into goose flesh. Do you hear me, son? It's mine. Father Clausen had arranged a one-bedroom apartment for us on a sloppy street beside an Italian restaurant. It was close to St. Elizabeth's, the hospital where Dad could go if he needed to see a doctor. And I mean the other sort of doctor too, Father Clausen reminded us. A psychiatrist. If he gets any worse, or if you boys are ever afraid he'll hurt you, just pick up the phone and call St. Elizabeth's right away. I've written the number to the psychiatric crisis line right here next to the phone. They also said the church would pay all of Dad's medical bills, so none to worry about that. And there was a Murphy bed in the living room, he told us. Said there would be room for all of us as long as my brother and I shared a bed. He spoke a last hurried blessing, and then he left. The apartment smelled like garlic bread and had nubby carpeting with gold and burgundy curlicues, like carpet from a movie theater lobby. There was something called a kitchenette, which was a half-sized icebox, a sink, and a hot plate on an island of dingy linoleum that curled up where it met the carpet. Father Clausen said he chose this apartment because it had belonged to a man with polio. The door that led in from the alley had a wide ramp and a rail for Dad's wheelchair, and above the bathtub and toilet were special bars where he could grab on if he needed to. The countertops in the kitchen and bathroom were only half as high as normal so he could reach everything. Dad sat in his wheelchair in the kitchenette, smoking Pall Malls and yelling slurs at the two black porters who had toted our luggage from the airport. We didn't have much, mostly just second-hand clothes and dishes from the nuns in San Tomas. The pair of big men struggled up the wheelchair ramp with something heavy wrapped in black duvetine. They set it down in the corner and were wiping their brows when Dad yelled, "You stupid spooks! Are you gonna put that right in front of the radiator?" He dropped his cigarette in the sink and wheeled angrily across the room. "Be careful with that, goddammit! Do you even know what this is?" He yanked off the duvetine. Rory and I froze, staring, not believing. "It's my goddamn leg! That's what it is!" There it was. Dad's rotten leg, bobbing inside a glass tube as high as my shoulders. Steel caps closed the tube at the top and bottom, bolted tight with pieces that looked like chrome lug nuts. A paper with a big orange symbol that said biohazard stuck to the glass with strips of wrinkly white tape. and a few paragraphs of medical words filled the space beneath the symbol. Beyond that, the gray mess of craters and boils floated like a fleshy jellyfish in the pale, yellow preservative. Cost me half my nutsack and a gold pocket watch. Good thing you darkies are hot for bribes and shiny things, or it'd be halfway to Alabama by now, on its way to be poked apart by some egghead with a microscope up his ass. One of the black men took a step toward Dad, like he might hit him, but the other man touched his elbow and shook his head. And after that, they both left and closed the door behind them. The lights in our new apartment were dimmed by puddles of dead moths settled in their yellow fixtures. The fluorescent over the kitchenette flickered constantly, like it was sucking its electricity through a bent straw. There was not enough light, or space, or air. We all stood together in our new home, not speaking. Me, my brother, my dad, and his preserved amputated leg. Rory turned 17 that spring and fibbed himself a year older so he could join the Navy. I tried and begged him not to leave, but he went anyway. He hugged me and told me he'd be back before I knew it, but he couldn't look me in the eye, and we both knew he was abandoning me. He was leaving me alone with Dad. Dad smoked cigarettes all day and watched game shows on TV. The Price is Right was his favorite, he said, because when Bob Barker picked a pretty woman to guess the prices, you could see her tits bouncing as she ran down the stage. Hell, doesn't even have to be a pretty one, he said, lighting a fresh cigarette off the old one. We mostly ate takeout from White Castle and Carl's Jr., but sometimes at the end of the month, before Dad's disability check arrived, I'd use the hot plate to warm up food for us. Mostly frozen things, corn dogs, pizzas, chicken pot pies in flimsy tins made of foil. We'd eat off paper plates sitting at a card table we'd found folded up under Dad's bed. Once, I tried to make beef stroganoff, but when the time came to eat it, I couldn't. I couldn't get past the thick gravy and slippery noodles sliding over bits of meat. After the stroganoff, I had a hard time eating altogether. The feeling of chewed food churning around in my mouth made me sick to my stomach. I lost weight. I took long baths and showers, liking the feeling of scrubbed skin and the closed door between me and Dad. In the afternoons, I sat outside on the wheelchair ramp and pretended to read catalogs. From there, I could see people walking past on the sidewalk, but they couldn't see me. I saw the public school kids walking home from the bus stop, and housewives on their way back from the baker and the butcher. Once, I thought I saw the Irish girl walking past with a loaf of French bread and a sack of tangerines, but I couldn't be sure it was her. I couldn't remember if I'd ever seen her face. I slept long nights on the pilled mattress of the Murphy bed. Dad's leg glowered from its pedestal, a wooden table with one wobbly leg that Dad made Rory and me drag in off the curb. He said the table would hold fine as long as we propped the broken leg with a stack of flattened cigarette cartons. And it did. My dreams were bad, and got worse as the summer wore on. The worst dream of all came on the night it happened, the night after the 4th of July. I remember because it was right before the heat wave broke. You remember? The bad one that tripped the grid and blacked out the entire east side? Has it been over a month already? Oh, Christ. You lose track. That night was the hottest night I'd seen since the chapel in the jungle. The apartment was stale and suffocating, and the reek of garlic and cigarettes and formaldehyde was everywhere. I felt miserable and feverish, even after I'd stripped down to my underwear and cranked the knob on the window fan as far as it would go. My stomach gnawed as I lay sleepless, watching red digits on the clock radio in the kitchenette stack minutes into hours. It was a little past 3 when I heard a crack like a gunshot, a transformer shorting out. The fan blades stopped whirring and all the street lamps went dark. I'd never thought about how much light comes in through a person's windows, even with the curtains closed. But suddenly, the whole apartment was black as pitch. The clock radio clicked into battery mode and its red glow gave shape to the card table, the icebox, and the world's biggest pickled pig's foot. I heard the door to Dad's room creak open, telling me the transformer had woken him up too, and he would need a couple cigarettes and a spoonful of carnation and maybe half an hour on the toilet listening to his own satisfied grunts to soothe him back to sleep. A sound came from the hall like something catching or dragging on the carpet. I tried to climb out of bed to help, thinking he'd wedged his wheels against the baseboards again. But, as always happens in nightmares, I found myself fixed flat on my back, paralyzed and numb. The dragging sound grew louder and closer. I panicked. Fear swarmed through me and I screamed at my frozen muscles, "Get up! Get up, Jesus, get up!" But my arms and legs were too heavy or too weak or too tired. My eyes raced to the only scrap of light, the red glow of the clock, and something was wrong. The light was all wrong. It wasn't doing something it usually did. Wasn't casting the right shadow on the linoleum. It wasn't casting the shadow of the leg. The leg was gone. The steel caps were still locked tightly in place, but nothing floated in the yellow preservative except a layer of fallen off bits that formed chunky sediment at the bottom of the tube. The dragging came again, this time right next to the Murphy bed. I squeezed my eyes shut, pressing hot tears between my eyelashes, and for the first time in a long time, my lips moved silently in frantic prayer. Slowly, I rolled my eyes to the side of my head, and I saw it. The ghastly, rotten leg. It was coming for me, sliding through the dark, using the rubbery remains of its toes to drag itself across the rough theater lobby carpet. Strings of flesh and the knob of a jellied femur left a trail of preservative to show where it had been. And I could smell it. Not the formaldehyde smell, but the smell from beneath the palmettos. The smell of maggots feasting on raw cheeseburgers, of flesh rotting in the tropical sun. I felt a tug at the sheets and the exposed knuckle of the leg's big toe appeared above the mattress. I felt myself losing it, delirious with fear. Then came the second toe, struggling over the hump, gripping the sheet like a monkey to pull itself up, onto the mattress. The other toes followed as the leg slithered into bed with me. I gagged on the stench and the fear and the feel of spongy flesh against my belly. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I was going to drown in fear. I shut my eyes and felt my heart thump out one more massive helping of blood before everything went bright white. And then I was awake. I leapt out of bed and wheeled around, sweeping my eyes to the tube in the corner. It bobbed there, innocently in the red glow, as if to say, "See? I've been right here the whole time." The blood rushed from my head and I dropped to my hands and knees, weak. My ribs stood out from my chest as I breathed in and out. My heart skipped and started. I think I might have grayed out for a while. I was so tired and so hungry and so weak. I looked up at the leg, hating it. I wanted everything back the way it was. I wanted to walk into our old kitchen and find Dad standing on 2 feet in front of the stove, flipping a batch of his famous hotcakes and practicing aloud his sermon for the day. I wanted Rory to come back and make me believe I wasn't alone anymore. I wanted to sink my teeth into a hamburger, or a banana, or a slice of roast beef without feeling my tongue begin to explore its imaginary craters and boils. I wanted to be rid of it. All of it! The tube was easier to break than you'd think. It really only took one good whack with the hot plate to shatter the entire thing. Dad heard the noise, of course, but he must have considered his own obvious limitations because he didn't even try to pull me off. He screamed curses at me from his wheelchair, and when that didn't work, he dialed the number Father Clausen had written next to the phone. Then you guys came and brought me here. At first you strapped me to the bed, but I got that privilege back for good behavior. I'm not sure how long it took you guys to arrive after Dad called. I don't really remember that part at all. I expect it probably took longer than usual on account of the blackout. All I remember is a terrible, throbbing urgency to have Dad back. The real Dad. The Dad who'd made us pancakes and hated the smell of ashtrays, and who stood sweating before a tribe of villagers intent only on the word of God. The Dad who'd said in a voice I can now recall only as an echo, "Take and eat. This is my body, given for you. Do this in remembrance of me."
Chilling tales for dark nights.